Well, hello and welcome. My name is Shannon Kemp, and I'm the Executive Editor for Dataversity. We would like to thank you for joining today's Dataversity webinar, Let's Talk Metadata, Strategies and Success, the 9th in a monthly series called Data Ed Online with Dr. Peter Aiken. Sorry, Peter, I'm fumbling
you can
today.
make me daughter, I don't mind.
It's a series that highlights sections within the DAMA Guide to the Data Management Body of Knowledge, brought to you in partnership with Data Blueprint. Now let me give the floor to Megan Jacobs, the webinar organizer from Data Blueprint, to introduce our speaker and today's webinar. Megan.
Thanks, Shannon. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Megan Jacobs, and I'm the webinar coordinator here at Data Blueprint. We are so excited that you all found the time to join us for today's webinar on Let's Talk Metadata, Strategies and Successes. As always, a big thank you goes out to Shannon Kemp and Dataversity for hosting us. We will get started in just a few moments after I introduce your speaker and also let you know about some housekeeping items. We are planning 1 hour for the presentation, followed by a 30-minute Q&A session. As Shannon already mentioned, due to the large number of participants, we have everyone on mute, but we will be collecting questions via the public chat. We will try to answer as many questions as time allows at the end, but feel free to submit them as they come up throughout the session. And to answer the top 2 of your most commonly asked questions, yes, you will receive an email with links to download today's materials and any other information you request during the session within the next 2 business days. You can find us on Twitter and Facebook. We've set up the hashtag DataEd on Twitter, so if you are logged on, feel free to use it in your tweets and submit your questions and comments that way. We will keep an eye on the Twitter feed, and we'll introduce answer to those questions in our Q&A towards the end as well. We also want to let you know about a brand new LinkedIn group. Data Management and Business Intelligence is the name of it. It is a great place to keep up with industry news, connect with other data management professionals, and gain access to educational resources. All right, well, now let me introduce you to our speaker. Dr. Peter Aiken is an internationally recognized thought leader in the data management field. Many of you already know him and have seen him at conferences nationally and worldwide. He has more than 30 years of experience and has received many awards for his outstanding contributions. He is the founding director of Data Blueprint, associate professor of information systems at VCU, and president of DAMA International. Peter has held a variety of positions, 2 of them at the Department of Defense and Software Engineering Institute. By now, he has written 7 books and dozens of articles. He has experience with more than 500 data management practices in 20 countries and consistently named as one of the top 10 data management experts in the world. He is highly desired at conferences and workshops and always traveling to numerous speaking engagements and projects. Just recently, he was in Brazil. Peter, where are you today?
Well, Megan, you know exactly where I am. I'm looking at you right here. So, yeah, we actually landed in Virginia for a little bit, although we're on our way to Minneapolis next week. So looking forward to seeing the Minneapolis chapter for all that. And, again, thanks for introduction here, and good morning, everybody. One of my favorite topics, and I hate to sort of do favorites on these because, of course, everything in data management is important, but metadata is really fundamental. So as always, brought to you by Data Blueprint and Virginia Commonwealth University School of Business here. Here's our agenda for the day. We're going to look at an overview of data management and talk about what metadata is and why it's important. We're going to look at metadata types, subject areas. We'll talk about benefits and sources of metadata that you can look at. Then we'll come up to a higher level and talk about specifically implementation strategies, get to some building blocks, guiding principles, and I'm going to finish up with an example. Hopefully you'll be able to stick around for it, that seems to have worked, which is that when you're trying to explain this to somebody else, it helps if you've got something very concrete. So I've prepared an example today that involves iTunes, which most people are very familiar with. And I'll show you a little bit about how metadata and iTunes works together. Hopefully that'll be something you guys can use to help educate your colleagues in IT and in business. So let's jump in. Data management overview. Again, this is, as Megan said, a attempt to try to get more of you all into the data management space with the proper credentials. So the credentials evolve around the data management body of knowledge that we put together at Data International. You can see the wheel. We started out with data governance in the center in January, and then February was data architecture management. We're working our way clockwise around, so we're almost with a full year cycle on this. And notice just in red there, I've highlighted metadata. It's spelled meta space data in the body of knowledge. I'll get to that reason in just a little bit. Also, just so that you have an idea on this, the body of knowledge is not strictly a technical document. We bring into it organizational culture, activities, deliverables, roles and responsibilities, et cetera, et cetera. If we try to do these things as strictly technical activities, they simply do not succeed. And when we're talking about data management, we always like to give an overview of what do we mean by data management. And this is one of those wonderful after-lunch confusing charts. If anybody wants to see what the actual details of the chart are, just get in touch with us. Be glad to do it. But this high-level management overview goes like this. There are 5 data management functions. The first one is to manage data coherently. That is, make sure that everybody is singing off the same sheet of paper. You'll be surprised how often I go into organizations where the DBAs are doing one thing and the data architects are doing something else. Now, if you've ever heard a barbershop quartet rehearse, that's not what you want to listen to. We've got to get past that rehearsal stage, because in business, this is all about performance. So managing the data coherently is the most important component of that. The next one is sharing data across organizational boundaries, whether it's program to program, part of our organization to another part of our organization, or whether it's between our organization and a business partner that we've set up. We've got to make sure that data is shared appropriately, efficiently, and effectively, but at the same time, we also want to make sure that we want to not share data with people who shouldn't be getting access to it. Again, those of you that are involved in HIPAA and things like that know it's a big challenge. In fact, if you think about it, if you can't manage your data, how are you going to secure it? So we're a necessary prerequisite to any sort of data security operations that go on. The third function is data stewardship. This is making it personal. If we just say that data quality is everybody's responsibility, nobody ends up doing anything about it. But the minute you put down and say, Peter, your job is, or your next raise next year is 15% or 50% or 100% dependent upon you improving the quality of these items, then it's going to become useful and important, and I'm going to pay attention to it. Fourth function is data development. This is the idea that we are engineering data delivery systems, and I use the word engineering very specifically because it is a different discipline from IT, and it does bring some additional concepts that go in here that are very, very interesting. You'll see them throughout the presentation. But the other part of it is what we teach in college and universities is that the answer to data development is build new databases. There are also virtualization, XML, and portals and all sorts of other things, delivery channels that we can use. So we're not going to get folks coming out of colleges and universities with these knowledge, skills, and abilities. We're depending on you all to turn them back into your organization. The fifth function in data management then is maintain data availability, and that's backup and recovery, tuning, performance management, et cetera, et cetera. So when we look at this overall picture of data management, you can see it's a fairly complex and involved picture here. And again, we're not going to spend time today going about it. Let's dive into the material and take a look at what we mean by metadata management. Now, each section of the DMBOK is organized in this fashion. This is an IPO diagram: inputs, processes in the center in the teal, and outputs on the right-hand side there. Hopefully, you're going to be familiar with all of these terms and technologies when we finish the end of the session here. So let's move to the next section. What is metadata and why is it important? Well, first of all, let's talk about the way it works. When we start to combine words, we put a dash between them. And over time, the dash ends up becoming lost. There's lots of examples of this around this. So we started out by meta-data. We're now putting the two terms together. Just be aware there is a group that owns a patent. I've included a little snippet of the patent application on there. So they used to run around and sue people if you use the term metadata, but that's one of those patents that's just absolutely unenforceable. So if that's what it isn't, let's talk about what it is. First of all, metadata is everywhere, every data management activity, and it's integral to all IT systems and applications in there. Metadata is to data what data is to real life. Real life describes transactions, things like that, and metadata reflects those transactions and the knowledge of those transactions. Metadata is the data that describes the structure and workings of an organization's use of information. A great quote from David Hayes' new book out in that area. And metadata is data that describes various facets of the data asset for purposes of improving it. The last one I've put down there, though, in red that I really like is that Gartner came out with a good definition in 2010 that says metadata unlocks the value of data, and therefore it requires management's attention. I really like that one a lot. Metadata management then is the set of processes that give us the ability to create, store, and integrate metadata around the organization. This is somewhat analogous to libraries and card catalogs that probably most of us are familiar with, although the young people these days are, you went to a library. Why did you go to a library? Well, that's where the books were. Books? Where are the books? What's a book? You can imagine these things going on. Well, in the old days, we would go to the library, and if we had a subject we were looking up, we would search for different books. We would look in these little 3x5 cards and try to find things, and the card catalog showed the author, the tags, actually things that we use today in today's environment. In order to do that, it also told us the location of the book. Now, we do that today by linking, but without the card catalog, finding books in the library would have been extraordinarily difficult. Excuse me. So readers may go to a lot of different places if the metadata didn't exist. So the metadata in the library context unlocks the value of the library's catalog within there, and that allows people in this case to quickly and efficiently gain access to the information that they need. The metadata is the card catalog, it's the descriptive tags that are there, and it shows where people find information in various repositories around the organization. It provides details on where the data came from, how it got there, what types of transformations that are there, maybe some level of quality. These are all things that we can incorporate in our definition of metadata, and it gives people clues as to what the data really means and how to interpret it. Now, a little graphic that came up, and give a shout out to my colleague Brad Melton who put this particular graphic together. Metadata is any combination of the circle and the data in the center. So if I have data and I need to know who about that data, that becomes metadata. If I need to know where, that becomes metadata. Hopefully that's clear. If it's not, we'll get to some questions when we get there. But I'm going to use that little motif, if you will, to take us through. So library example, who, the author of the book, what's the title, where's the shelf location, when, publication date. So it works out very, very nicely. Again, a small amount of metadata in the card catalog unlocks the value of a large amount of data in the library. Now, this is for reference materials and data, but if you have metadata about your software systems, you can use this same type of structure to do it. Who was the author of the software program? What was the title? Where is the software stored? When is it used? What version are we looking at? All of these things map exactly onto that. Take another example. Many of you use Outlook or other types of mail programs, and you know how much trouble you have with your inbox as it is. It's very difficult to keep up with email in today's environment. So the who is the from and the tos. The what is the subject. The how is the priority. User ID inbox, again, is the location. Where might it be? Why, that's in the body of the material. When, sent and received. So again, we use this metadata, and Outlook uses this metadata, and all email programs use this metadata to find important stuff and weed out the junk, to organize for future access, and to make rules so that when you find something from the boss that doesn't make it through the spam filter, you make it rule to specifically make sure the boss's email gets through. Let's talk about what metadata then is in terms of how you need to practice it. Metadata practices are designed to link sources and uses of metadata. So the structure is that we have some metadata storage. Again, it may be a repository, it may be a spreadsheet. There's a number of different topics that you can look at in there, and we'll talk about them when we get to the technology section of the presentation. We have some engineering, though. We don't want to just willy-nilly store the data out there. We want the data to be organized. We want it to be structured in the proper format in order to do that. And then we also need to focus explicitly on delivering the metadata. It doesn't do any good to build a well-engineered metadata storage facility if nobody in the environment can gain access to it. And how do we keep track of all that? Governance keeps track of everything else within there. So again, we look at these four components in our metadata practices area, and you can see that when we execute these things, the engineering and delivery components implement the governance that we need to have in our metadata environment. That same graphic from this slide here that I just put up for you is at the center of this graphic now. And you can see that these metadata practices must be inextricably intertwined in order to properly fill this out. So I'm showing you an example. But one of the most important things to take away from this is that you end up having to do most of these things in three pieces. For example, you're all familiar with MDM. We did a session on that a couple of months back, master data management. In that area. And master data management is a wonderful set of technologies, but they're almost impossible to implement on their own. So you need to look at implementing them in conjunction with quality and governance. Those are three things that we need to link in the MDM environment. there. Well, here's another example, very similar type of thing. We may have some knowledge management going on, and that may be linked to a master data management practice in data quality engineering. You can see the link that binds them all together are all of these metadata practices that go into the center of this. So metadata really is at the heart of everything that we use. Now I'm going to go briefly through a little section here. We always include some reference material for you so that you are able to take away some of this if you haven't got a chance to do any research on your own. But metadata has been around for a long time, well preceding 1990. But in 1990 or so, it started to become important, and people started to look at these things. It was difficult, though, because there was a lack of standards, and there was a proprietary nature about many of these types of things. In fact, if you look over time, the software applications, the packages that we use, have decided that it's easier to support the user community that they have by exposing the metadata instead of keeping it proprietary, and to unlock the value there of their software so that you can gain access to their metadata layer very, very quickly. In the 90s, people began to recognize the value of these repositories. We've got newer tools that are now starting to expand the scope of these types of things. There's a lot of different benefits that come up, but one of the most important ones is this semantic layer that now starts to become common, a vocabulary, if you will, between a company's systems and their business users. Metadata can be used to significantly reduce training costs in organizations, and it takes that strategic information and makes it even more valuable. One, it's easier to find, and two, you can now get away from statements that I like to make when I go to visit organizations for the first time. If they're not doing data quality, for example, you can say that authoritatively that all the data in your organization is of unknown quality. That's a rather scary statement to make to some organizations. And now that we can start putting quality measures on it, all of that becomes metadata. In other words, how good is the data is a metadata piece in there as well. Again, we can use it to create actionable information, and we can limit the scope of incorrect decisions that happen to come on there. Many of you are familiar with the Y2K problem. Some of you even survived that particular piece. Obviously, we couldn't have done Y2K if we didn't know where the date fields were used. Well, again, there's a very good use of metadata in there. Lots of data warehousing activities are important in that area as well. And of course, the World Wide Web is now starting to get us really involved in these efforts to link our systems to the web and seamlessly try to make the web smarter, whether you're working on Web 2.0 or Web 3.0, it's a help either way. We've seen some standardization efforts that have gone on, and I was involved in the first one. There was the CDIF. It was the opportunity to try and link case tools so that you could exchange process metadata with a data metadata tool, for example. That was one of our goals at the Defense Department when we funded that research. Another one was the Dublin Core, and this was the recognition that the library people already do a fabulous job of managing lots and lots of data and leveraging it. So the Dublin Core really represents a piece from the library community, but again, a very good place to go out and do this. Megan, I'm just going to make a note here. I probably should put some references on these so the folks can gain access to them next time. But if you just Google Dublin Core, guaranteed it'll come right to the top. That reminds me of one of my funnier faux pas. I was in Northern Ireland, and I kept hinting around because I still haven't had a chance to go to Dublin yet. I understand it's a beautiful city, and somebody raised their hand and said, Dr. Aiken, that would be Dublin, Ohio that you want to visit. They're the ones that actually did the Dublin Core there. Okay, great, but I still haven't been to Dublin yet. Anyway, ISO standards, we're going to look at the Common Warehouse metadata model, and there have been a number of metadata coalitions that we've put in place that are allowing people, again, to start exchanging data in this more modern environment. So what we're seeing nowadays is an updating of repositories so that the deployment is on the web. We're starting to see products that are supporting these Common Warehouse models. We're seeing vendors who are focusing in on metadata as product offerings. We're seeing the software systems expose their metadata in there. But there aren't very many organizations that are really going in and purchasing and developing metadata repositories. And in my opinion, those that are making a very significant investment, and those that are sustaining that investment are actually in a position to deliver business value at a much more effective level than organizations that are not. Again, what we're trying to do, it's hard to find people that have data skills. If you all qualify with your CDMPs, and by the way, when you do pass those CDMPs, send me just a quick note, because we're keeping track. We're approaching 1,000 individuals now around the world that have the CDMP designation, and we'd very much like to know when that occurs. It's not quite the same as Facebook going over 1 billion users, but we are now starting to tell the world there are people with these real skills. Now, that's data management skills. Metadata is even more abstract than that, which makes it a little bit more difficult as well. We've had some efforts that have failed, and we need people to understand that. The most cogent one right at the moment is everybody's been watching the Mars Explorer, and it's a wonderful thing. But remember, one of the first attempts at doing that, they sent it up, and 2 different vendors were using, one was using the metric system, the other was using English measurement. And of course, if you want to fire the retro rockets at 300 feet, but you set it to go off at 300 meters, it turned out it ran out of fuel and crashed into the surface of the planet at that point in time. Again, these are all metadata types of things. There was a great deal of interest in the market. It's gone through some refinement and retrenchment. And again, I think the product offerings out there are very, very strong at this point in time. And still, it's hard, it's been hard for us to have businesses understand the value of metadata. Metadata is probably a word that we wouldn't really even use in front of a lot of C-level executives, although they're becoming smarter, so I'm not as reticent to introduce that term. We've had other alternatives that people like it. Some people like to call it data resource management data. Some people just like to call it data about data. It seems to be a backward-looking thing, though, and this is really the key, is we want to show people that we can use this in today's environment and really come forward in a very, very quickly and effectively way to measure these things. Now, those of you that are joining us for the first time, we'd like to have a little bit of audience participation in here, so we're up to our first polling question. And the question is for you guys: what do you think has been the driving factor in focusing on metadata in the last decade? So we'll give a quick little bit of time for you guys to submit your answers on this. And I've got it set for 5 minutes. I'm sure we don't want to waste 5 minutes on that one. But give it just a minute and see what happens here. Let's see where we go. I should play the Jeopardy theme music, but if I did that, I'd probably have to owe Merv Graphic. We could hum it. Maybe that will do. Have we got enough responses on there now? Oh, okay. Well, maybe Shannon will tell us.
We've got quite a few responses. You want me to close the poll and ready to go? Can you see?
Let's give them a full minute on this, so we've got another 15 seconds if anybody's still in there. You know what we should do is start offering prizes for these things. That'd be really fun.
We can do that.
Yeah. And while we're waiting to finish that up, most of you guys know Shannon's actually out on the West Coast. Megan and I are on the East Coast, but oftentimes we're in 3 different complete parts of the universe, and none of us are asleep. So, it's fun. All right, what do we get for results? What do people say?
So I'm closing the poll.
We're still here.
It's closing. Let me share the poll results. And you should be able to see. So we have 60% said B.
Oh, wow. Okay. So those of you that guessed B, that's correct. There's a lot of challenges around regulatory requirements that are really driving metadata. And those of you that are familiar with HIPAA, of course, understand that in a very, very cogent session. Thanks for the help with that, Shannon. So again, what we're seeing here is this increasing importance on metadata. And the real driver behind it is that metadata provides leverage. Data management provides leverage for your business. So metadata is the lever that allows data management to be successful in organizations at the highest level. You can see on here again, Sarbanes-Oxley has some metadata requirements that go along with it. There are some improvements to the OMG that are coming along too that help us to recognize some of these areas as well. That's a good little bit on our history here. Let's move on. Again, what are the major metadata types and benefits? I've got a bunch of them listed here. These are by no means exclusive, but we can talk about process metadata in here. And again, the process metadata might be something that describes the way you're doing a business process within your organization. it is metadata. It is a higher level description of something that's going on at a lower level. So that's what we're really looking for, is that transcendence of a layer of abstraction there. And that's what allows it to do it. In fact, you get right down to it, it turns out that metadata really isn't a thing. It's more of a verb than a noun, but we won't fuss with those particular qualities that are there. By the way, another thing that you guys can do to be really useful is when you see process modeling going on in your organization, ask them where the process models are stored. And usually it's on somebody's computer, right? And so if you say, well, let me have a copy of it, and we'll put it in our, quote, repository for you, they'll come back to you after a couple of years and say, hey, remember those process models we did a couple of years ago? I can't find my copy. Do you have your copy? And of course you will, and you'll be able to go in and take a look at it. And more importantly, from your business process metadata, you'll be able to tell who created the documentation, what are the important dependencies among the processes, and how do the processes interact with each other. You can see this relates highly to architectural concepts that go into that. Another type of metadata, if you will, is business metadata. Again, what are the terms that the business folks use? So these are business names, concept areas, attribute types, ranges, descriptions, domain names, et cetera, but your business partners aren't going to know these terms, so they're going to be just descriptions of things for them, and that's really what we're interested in doing, is allowing them to understand that, but more importantly, maintain it in a formal sense. One of the companies I worked for maintained a formal engineering glossary, so that they were a very engineering-oriented company, and they did lots of things, and they understood that the glossary was a very important part for every engineer in the organization to be able to access it. And so they viewed metadata just as an extension of their existing glossary. You can see here also we have technical and operational metadata. Again, depending on which side we're coming from, we can look at specific information about how data is moved, et cetera, et cetera. Let me give you another specific example in the technical area. If we talk about ETL, we go extract and load. Those are the two end pieces of it. But now we need to go back in and take another look at it and say, what is that transformation? And it turns out your ETL jobs and libraries are a major source of operational metadata that you can use, because once those rules have been validated, they become useful for the entire organization. Again, this gives the auditors things they can come in and look at. It helps you with your data retention, encoding various conversions, and also the history of the results. By the way, you can go to metadata, right? That's just another level of abstraction at the top. And of course, if my doctoral students go through this realization, wow, if I'm doing metadata, I could also do metadata, right? You can take that on ad infinitum, which means that in the end you only need one table. Of course, that's silly, but they also realize what the impracticalness of having everything in one table is. So another type of metadata, stewardship. Again, who are the data stewards? What are they looking at? What are the data CRUD rules? CRUD stands for create, read, update, and delete. Those are the things you can do with data. And knowing those rules in themselves become metadata. I've got some other uses up there. Again, if you've got questions about that, you can certainly come back to us at the Q&A section on this. Finally, from a types of metadata, if you will, provenance is becoming a much more important concept, because people want to know where this came from. So this is the origin, the history, how it came along. And so if something's in the data warehouse, it'd be real nice if I could right-click on that particular piece of data, and go back and find out what its associated metadata was. I'm not suggesting that you build those systems, although I have worked with several companies who have found lots of good business value by doing that particular type of work. So where did it come from? Who did it, in other words, where did you get your numbers? This leads us to another topic in metadata too, which is talking about data branding. So one of the things I mentioned before, if all your data is of unknown quality, if you can draw a line around some data and say this data is of known quality, and you made your decision based on data from this pool of data, from this portal, from this system, whatever it is that you're using to fence around the data, this then becomes a very useful piece to take into it as well. I've got my data, and I used good data to put that information together, as opposed to using data of unknown quality, which may or may not be a harm to your organization, although I did work with one organization that had to restate earnings at one point in time due to a metadata error. That's always an icky prospect. Here are some subject areas that we can look at and again, see some examples of metadata. So I'm not going to read these all to you, but we've already talked about the quality piece. Looking at data governance, number 5 above it, you can see that some of the metadata would be the existence of the policy as well as the policies, the standards, the roles, things that you can look in there. Lots of these things that are out there in order to do this. One of them that's very popular these days is SOA. Everybody's excited about service orientation. And service orientation can allow us to do some really good things, but it works a whole lot better if you have good catalogs, good lists of services, good sets of master data that goes into the process. So again, these are just some things that you can do with metadata, allowing you to take a look at these things. Let's look at benefits and really some sources that go into it as well. Here we go for, again, some benefits. We want to increase the value of strategic information. All of your data, of course, is not of the same value in there. And so this is one of the things you want to look at is let's focus in on the important information. In fact, I'll take it a step further. Our studies really show that about 80% of the data in your organizations falls into the category of ROT, R-O-T, standing for redundant, obsolete, or trivial. And if it is redundant, obsolete, or trivial, why are you wasting organizational resources to actually maintain that data? Second one, reducing training costs. Again, having good access to metadata helps people tremendously in terms of being able to use that. In our December piece, I show an example of how that is used to help people understand specifically about system conversions and things like that. You can reduce the research time. Again, a lot of time people spend in software maintenance or even just doing tasks for people. 80% of their time ends up being spent locating the information, and 20% of the time is spent acting on it. Improving communication is another use and benefit of metadata, which allows people to share common language between business and IT. And if we're able to access information quickly, we ought to be able to speed up systems development time. And some good data coming out of my colleagues at Teradata actually tells us that an awful lot of savings can be gained from this. In fact, as much as 60% of the development costs can be saved by good, proper metadata work, which reduces your potential failure rate that goes into this. And finally, when you're in a business reengineering situation, having a good idea on your metadata allows you to very quickly and effectively go in and figure out what processes are impacted from that. So this would be a data process matrix, or CRUD matrix that we call them in many cases. Showing the impact of changes that are on there. And when you find out things that can be changed, you can also then prototype those changes before actually implementing them in a major way. There's another component for all this as well. We use the word unstructured data. I really don't like that term. If something was unstructured, you could not add structure to it. The definition of unstructured, but we can call it semi-structured data without any trouble. And again, metadata is used to describe both of these. It may be the case that when you do a search on your corporate search piece, you find messages from email, you may find documents that have been created, and you may have a link to a video that actually explains some of the components that all of this. So it can all be hybridized and pulled in one particular environment. Lots and lots of important and interesting applications that go into this. Many cases for the unstructured world, or the semi-structured world as I prefer to call it, is descriptive, structural, and administrative types of metadata. So it really exists everywhere. And let's move to our second polling question here now, which of these would not be an example of descriptive metadata? Catalog information, say SORI terms and keywords, or labels in there. So let's see what people have to say about that in terms of descriptive metadata. Again, we'll give you a minute or so to take a look at that and see what we come up with. By the way, we use your results on these because one of the things we're doing is measuring this over time and seeing how attitudes change. And one of the things we're seeing is people are, in fact, getting smarter about the whole process. Okay, so just a few more seconds on this one, and we'll ask Shannon what the results are for everybody. Everybody pretty much responded, Shannon?
Yep, we're looking good. So let me close the poll here. And it looks like we have 71% who said yes to C.
Interesting. The answer is actually B. So the thesaurus terms that we look at in this context here. Oops. Oh, okay. Megan had the wrong. Sorry, I had the wrong thing written down on my chart here. So thanks, Shannon, for that. Guys are mostly correct, not mostly incorrect. I want to make sure we get that right. Good deal. That's just me moving too fast and looking at my notes instead of actually looking at the question there. All right, well, again, you can see here the examples of descriptive metadata would be the catalogs and the thesaurus keywords. Examples of administrative would be access rights, was somebody allowed to get access to the field. This is, again, very big in healthcare right at the moment. And finally, structural metadata, the field structures and things, the XML schemas that are involved, all of these are going to be important attributes looking at that. So hopefully virtually anything that is named in the organization is potential metadata. And one of the things I want you guys to take away from this is that it's a really bad exercise to run around your organization and pick things and say, is it metadata? That's a really unproductive exercise because one person's metadata can be somebody else's data, and hopefully you see the opposite of that would be true. One person's data can be somebody else's metadata. So it depends. The real key there is that are you trying to gain leverage by increasing the scope of our abstraction that occurs in there? If we use this metadata properly, the question to ask your users when they're trying to ask you questions about metadata is not, is this metadata or not, but is this data something that we should include in the scope of our metadata management activities? I hope that makes sense to everybody. Again, if it doesn't, please get us on the Q&A session coming up in about 20 minutes on this. But it's very, very important that you don't get into a match that says this is metadata and that isn't. The question is, should this piece of data be included in the scope of our metadata practices? And if so, we may want to increase the scope or decrease the scope depending on what we're trying to take a look at. Let's look at some specific sources of metadata in here. So here we have some sources of metadata, which is an existing model. You guys may or may not be familiar with something called ADRM, which is a retail metadata model that you can purchase in the open market. It may be a conceptual model. It was created a couple of years back that would be interesting for it. It may be that we have some existing systems that we need to reverse engineer and understand what the metadata model comes out on them. And finally, it may be the enterprise data model, if you have one of those that you're working with, that may be very, very useful in order to do that. All of these add up to a bunch of capabilities that the organization has and that the organization can use those capabilities to solve very specific metadata problems. So that's the real main benefit from these things. Let's talk now about metadata strategies, all right, which again is to say, back to what I was just talking about a second ago, the increasing the scope of our metadata practices. All organizations have metadata. Not all organizations formally manage their metadata, but very likely all knowledge workers in their organization do some kind of formal or informal metadata management. Whether you're really, really good about organizing your email and your files and things like that, or whether you just have a good memory and you can remember where you stuff things. Well, what you want to do is you want to build your metadata strategy out of a set of defined components. It doesn't mean you have to go out and spend a lot of money at first. You can build them with building your own products and services. In fact, if you're interested in an example of that, we've got one on our website where we helped a small community, I'm losing the word here, savings bank. What's the word for it? Community Virginia. Oh, well. Anyway, it's a small bank, and help them build one of those on their own in a week's time. It was a very nice exercise, and they were very gracious to do a presentation at one of the conferences with us. But the key there is you've got to arrive with a very specific business problem and some business users who are committed to actually doing some metadata work in that process. Now, the typical process that we will show you on how to build metadata, right? You get this sort of a piece here which says metadata strategy initiation, conduct stakeholder interviews, access the existing metadata sources and information architecture, develop your future architecture, and do a phased implementation of the rest of it. And there's nothing wrong with this. But really do understand that you don't know what you don't know as you're starting out. So one of the things we encourage organizations to do is to put together their own metadata repository-like functionality so that you use that functionality to educate yourself as if you had one. Now, if you do that for a year, then you'll be capable of having a really good conversation with a technical person who's trying to help you pick or evaluate among competing technologies that you have there. Not all organizations are doing this, but it's kind of like, going to buy a car where you're only familiar with walking if you don't understand car maintenance and things like that. If you pretend you have a car for a year and pretend you're filling things up with gas and these sort of things, you'll have some time at the end of that process to go back and reflect on what you've learned, and then you can have a really good conversation with a car dealer about that process. Again, I hope that's clear. If it's not, please do ask us some questions when we get to the end of this. Let's look at the building blocks in here, and again, this is our sort of progress map. We started out back in January with governance, and we're going to work our way through these things in the next few minutes. Goals and principles. Okay, what are we trying to do? Well, we're trying to provide the organization with an understanding of terms and usage in the organization. I mentioned before that one engineering organization I'd worked with, they wanted to know that when you said a brick, okay, this brick meant the same thing to every engineer in the entire organization. And that's a really good way to do it with a metadata glossary. You need to incorporate metadata from diverse sources so that people understand the true value of metadata comes from the integration of these sources, not from the actual metadata itself. You've got to provide easy access to this. It's got to be web-based, it's got to be things people can gain access to, and it's got to be simple enough that even a business person, a non-technical person, can actually use it. And finally, you've got to ensure if your data quality is not good, if you put poor metadata on top of poor quality data, it doesn't mean anything. It's a wasted effort. So you do want to emphasize quality in the metadata space, and finally, of course, security as well, because there are some reasonable and unreasonable types of activities and uses in the metadata area. So what are the activities that we're looking at here? First one, understand what your metadata requirements are, not organization-wide, not even for an entire business unit, but the metadata requirements for a particular business problem. Then define yourself a metadata architecture that allows you to develop a problem solution within that space, within the confines of the first project that I'm telling you to start on this, and look specifically at metadata standards and say, look, within the metadata, let's talk about what it means to have a good definition of these things, to fully populate the fields, to make sure that the subject matter expert is referenced appropriately in there. Then implement these things in a managed metadata environment. Now, again, I've used this word a couple times, this phrase. You can go out and buy a repository, and that's some money, and it'll cost you some things, and there are lots of organizations that will benefit from that. At the same time, however, you can also build yourself a metadata repository-like functionality, which may be something much lower in scale and much smaller in scope to do that. And that is actually a better way to go, and play with that for a couple of months, because then after you've done that for a little bit, you're much smarter than you would have been if you're just trying to do this without knowing what's on the other side of this. So again, we very much advocate a crawl, walk, run strategy in that area, as opposed to going back and trying to do the big bang all at once. Okay, step 5, again, you're going to be creating and maintaining metadata. So we're going to start to now increase the scope of our metadata efforts from 0 to something greater than 0, and use this knowledge to bring metadata in there. You're going to bring in metadata in slices, and if we had more time here, I'd actually build you a slice of metadata that shows how you take a data model and you can pull the metadata out of it very, very quickly. Because as you do, you're going to be bringing in new piles of metadata, and you're going to need to integrate that metadata with your existing metadata. By the way, this is a really good approach to mergers and acquisitions as well. So people tend to start off by merging systems as opposed to merging data. And I don't even advocate merging data until you've merged metadata, because that really does give you a much better approach to that. Then you're going to, quote, manage your metadata repository. It may be something as simple as a spreadsheet kept by an individual for starters. You may then grow it to an Access or a SQL Server database. and start to do that. And many organizations end up stopping there because they don't need to go any further than that. Finally, distributing and delivering metadata, a part that's just neglected almost all the time. If we've always got to find Ron, who's the guy that knows the metadata, that's not a very good metadata delivery mechanism. And finally, you need to query, report on, and analyze what you're doing in metadata so that you can show progress and decide how things are working in that area. Again, let's look at standards, because standards are going to be important in this area as well. Oops, I'm sorry, I went one slide too many. There we go. Standards are great if there are only a few of them, but we have lots of standards. So you do have to be a little bit savvy about the process and taking a look in here and seeing how standards are going to work into your organization. Some of you have no choice. Those of you that are in the EU have to work on some of the European standards that are there. It's both good and bad. It makes your job simpler, but it also means that you have sort of a one-size-fits-all on that. Here in the U.S., we haven't gotten nearly as sophisticated as all that, and so we don't have quite the reliance on standards. But again, if you have standards, think about it. If we put the Y2K standard in before, we would not have had to go back and do all that work around expanding the date field from 2 digits to 4 digits. In there. Another component of the standards area is the whole common warehouse metadata, and many of you have data warehouses that you're working with. Turns out there's a very nice meta model for using the various processes and operations around warehousing so that you can compare the operation of your various data warehouses to each other in there. Another one is the information management meta model by the object group. They're looking to replace the common warehouse metadata model with that. It's not fully done yet. There's still a lot of the other out there. But it does give you the ability to look at technology modeling, map that into model management, and comparing related models across time. You can see this is based on the standard core model that's out there, and you can see how it's related, all of these things. Again, this is fairly sophisticated. It's important to know the destination where you're headed, but you may only be building 1 or 2 pieces of this out as you start your initial delivery on this. What are the deliverables from a metadata practice? Well, you have to have some form of place where you're storing metadata. Again, my term that I like is metadata repository-like functionality. And that way you can play with that for a year or so and then go have a really good conversation with the various metadata solution vendors. You've got to have quality metadata. Before I mentioned, again, if your data is of poor quality and you put poor quality metadata in there, nothing will relate to anything else, so that's going to be a huge challenge for you. You're going to need to start understanding what it means to analyze metadata as you're looking through the process and figuring out what's going on and what uses people are making of it. One of the things that we did at one of the groups that we were with in our first web-based implementation was we remembered to turn cookies on. Great idea, because if we aren't able to put our cookies in place, then what we have is we're not able to answer questions. Like all of a sudden, I had the CIO coming to me and saying, what is this group in Thailand asking these questions for? And it turned out they found the metadata very useful in their systems efforts. Again, I mentioned the lineage or the provenance of the data before, but another part is when somebody comes to you and says, if I make this change, how big a change is it? So metadata is what you would use to estimate the scope of the impact analysis. Again, metadata is what your control procedures are written in, but it's what your models and architecture are written in. It's what your management of metadata and also your operational analysis is written in. In fact, your governance, your data governance is going to speak in a metadata vocabulary as they start to mature in there. There are a lot of components that are involved in here. Again, we've got all sorts of suppliers, participants, and consumers. We can't possibly satisfy all of these at once. This is the main challenge. Every organization is different, having different technology needs. So it's absolutely crucial that you identify subsets of these for specific problems, but you need to have at least one from each group for the problem. If you're trying to do this with just suppliers and participants and not talking about consumers, you will fail in terms of that. I've already mentioned metadata repository several times. Your data modeling tools and your data models should be stored under that metadata management purview. Your database management systems, your integration tools that you have, any sort of business intelligence systems management tools, object modeling, process modeling, report generating, it goes on and on and on, and all of these things are crucial. Again, the key is not to try and boil the ocean and to try and be comprehensive about it, but to start off in one part of the organization and work your way forward. I just can't emphasize that enough. I see so many groups that have these great ideas. They'd like to implement everything, but it's just not possible. Again, we've been dealing with a down economy here in the States for a long time. So I imagine many of you are really reluctant to go and ask your bosses for any additional money for some things, but this is one that is worthwhile investing in there. All right, let's get into some guiding principles, and we'll finish up with the example here as we get back to the top of the hour on this. We've got a bunch of them that we've got in place. First of all, establish and maintain metadata strategy and appropriate policies. It's great to have a charter. It helps to have some very clear goals and objectives for your metadata management and usage, and it's okay to say I'm going to create metadata to help one user solve one problem because it has a tremendous leverage effect and it will save the organization lots of money. Remember, this is not an academic exercise. You're not doing this because you should do it. You need to do it because there's business value. Second one is making sure that you can, after you've established the business case, get some sort of sustained commitment and vocal support from management in terms of your metadata management. I told a data governance story a while back about the Secretary of the Army doing some work for us on one of the projects that we were on. It was a tremendous effort. I wish that many of the corporations that I work with had as much strength of character to stand up and say we're going to do this properly. I see many organizations that just aren't willing to take that step, and it's a problem. But if you present them with a good enough business case, most organizations will come around in the long run. It's important to take an enterprise perspective on this, but remember, think big but deliver incrementally. Again, it's important to do that on a very careful and cautious basis. You've got to develop your strategy before evaluating and purchasing specific products and procedures. After all, by the way, if you're the federal government, you violate the law if you don't do that, but it just makes good sense otherwise. Look at the standards that are out there. See what things are going to be useful for you, what standards can be managed for specific groups, and what standards can be managed across the enterprise as a whole. Make sure that you've got good metadata acquisition processes. Now, some of your metadata acquisition is going to be automated, and some of it will be automated, and some of it will be manual. So look at all three options that you can do that. And again, here also make sure that user access, because if you just grab the metadata and put it in a repository and nobody gains access to it, it's going to be a problem. Again, I forget who it was that was telling me they went into an organization at one point in time and there were 60 reports they were producing a month. They were very proud of the fact that they were producing 60 reports. And I said, the fellow who was talking to me, he said, I said, turn them off. And so they didn't deliver them next week, and nobody complained. Well, if nobody complained, they weren't being used, and if they weren't being used, why were you producing them in the first place? Guiding principle number 8, understand and communicate the necessity of metadata. You may need to do that by having people listen to a replay of this webinar if you want, or again, lots of other places on the web where you can find this value, but it's important to have it internally too and say that company X values metadata practices, and we'll continue to do that. Again, number 9, measure the content and usage of the things that you're looking at. 10, if you're not looking at XML and metadata simultaneously, you really are missing an opportunity there. So again, we're not doing XML in this particular one, but I've got books that are out on that subject, or just ask us some questions there. Again, make sure that you've got stewardship, business involvement, and making sure that there's accountability for this. Make sure the business understands that this is a practice that will lower their cost to IT solutions in order to do that. Monitor your processes and procedures and make sure that people are implementing the thing correctly. Include specific roles on staffing and things. Again, if you just put somebody in charge of a library, they wouldn't have the right background to know how to manage the library of information. Similarly, here we have specific knowledge, skills, and ability. You all are at the start of that particular process. There's much more to go in order to come up with all of these things. Look specifically for metadata experts on the project that go into this. You may need some consulting help at some point in that, and go as far as certifying the quality. Say that the things that we have in there are of certified metadata quality. Okay, again, our example here that we're going to dive into now. Most of you are familiar with iTunes, and I just want to take you through an example of this because I had somebody ask me at a conference one time in the Q&A session. They said, well, does iTunes use metadata? And I said, oh my goodness, yes, of course. Apple's an engineering company. Metadata is crucial to things that they do. So let me show you how iTunes has metadata. If I take a track of a bunch of CDs, for those of you that are young, those are things we used to listen to music on in the old days before MP3 players came along. And I stick the CD into the iTunes music library. You can see what happens. It goes out there and it says, hey, I put this CD in iTunes, says, well, I can figure out how many tracks are on the CD, and they're very clearly labeled track 01 through track 25. It also can tell me how long each track is. Well, again, interesting, but I'm not sure that's really valuable if I'm looking for a specific track that I want to play somebody at a specific location. So right out of the box, that's what you've got in terms of metadata for that. But Apple built in some more stuff into there. And again, this is not Apple specific. It's just that iTunes seems to be somewhat ubiquitous. So you'll notice at the very top there, we have the note that it says it's accessing the GraceNote Media Database. GraceNote has put together a database of all the CDs in the world. And it can figure out, through a number of different algorithms, which CD you just inserted. So now I've gone from track 1 through track 25 to, oh my goodness, I've got 25 tracks. I've got the name. I've got the artist. I've got the album it came from. I've even got a genre that's been assigned to that particular CD. So when I connect to it, it grabs it, retrieves the CD name, the artist, the tracks, the genre. Are we done? No. Let's take it a little bit further. Apple, now that you've figured out which album it is, maintains some libraries so that you can go out there and pull in the cover of that. So the CD that I stuck in there was Miles Davis, The Complete Birth of the Cool, and it brings that back. Well, again, think where we were a few minutes back. We just had a list of tracks and the timing that they are. Now I know I'm working with Miles Davis as one of his most famous albums that was there. It sure would be a pain to type in all that information. And by the way, I have seen people doing this, where people will sit down and start typing in their information. Now, what else can you do with metadata in your iTunes piece? Well, you can create something called a smart playlist. So I can say, I want to put a playlist for where the artist contains the word Miles Davis. And when I do that, it helps me to organize it, and I end up with this. Although, notice I didn't get the results that I wanted. Again, here I've got 2 albums in here, and I was just trying to get The Birth of the Cool, but I also picked up a Live at the Fillmore East CD that happened to already be into that particular piece. I had another iTunes recording in there. So I need to fine-tune that metadata request in order to get the results that I'm looking for. So I'm going to go out to that little list again there and tell it Miles Davis, but I want the album title to be Maintains the Complete Birth of the Cool. And now I can move that playlist to a Miles Davis folder and put it in with all the rest of my other Miles Davis pieces and organize my 60-some gigabytes that I've got of metadata and MP3 recordings that are on my computer. Now, having done this, that looks pretty darn useful, I hope. But notice what Apple did. All right, we'll go through that. They use that exact same set of metadata for managing anything that goes into iTunes. In other words, I can do television programs, podcasts, books, apps that come into there, and they use that same metadata structure. So Apple architected this originally to just handle songs, and now we go to movies, podcasts, books, and even software applications. They architected it to the same interface, the same processing, the same data structures are now applied to all of these other things in there, including PDF files as well. So I use this and actually encourage my students to use this to organize their class notes around things like iTunes University and all that. So that's our little 1-hour piece on metadata. Again, what we've done here is hopefully you can look at this chart and see everything that we've covered in that very fast 60 minutes going through here. Just for your reference, we've done 72 slides in a little under 60 minutes. We always include in here some references, additional reading and things. There's some very, very good books out there that are on it. And with that, we're going to turn it back over to Shannon so we can do the Q&A. I'm sorry, Megan. Shannon doesn't do the Q&A. She does the questions for us. So it's your turn now. Let's see what we've got for questions for everybody.
Thank you, Peter. That was a great presentation. Now it's time for our Q&A. Time for you guys to ask your questions, so just click on the Q&A chat feature and you should be able to submit your questions through the chat window. We've had a few come in already, so we can go ahead and get started. The first question is, do MDM systems work well with big data?
Do MDM systems work well with big data? Well, that's an interesting question. Let me not address it in exactly that fashion. By the way, before we get too thoroughly confused into that area, I've got another colleague who's working on an alternate definition for MDM, which I kind of agree. We've been using MDM as master data management in there, but you know, if we actually did master definition management, wouldn't that be a whole lot more useful for organizations? We'll have some conversations around that in the future, but let's go back to it. First of all, one of the things you're going to need to do, and one of the hardest parts of MDM just by itself, is figuring out what is master. What do we mean by master data? Now, we did a whole webinar on this a couple months back, and I've got some guidance in there that helps you out. But I contend, and I think I've been very successful with helping organizations understand this, if you don't have an objective criteria for defining what master data means to your organization, then the rest of the results are going to be pretty squishy. Let me just give you an example. I had one organization that I worked with that had several divisions, and they said for us, master data is any data that is used by more than one division. Okay, that's a fine rule. It may not be a correct rule, but it's very objective, because when we look at any piece of data, if it transcends, crosses those divisional boundaries, it is then considered master data. Now the question of, does MDM work within big data? All right, so we've got this new term of big data, and it's variety, velocity, value, you know, these 3 or 4 V's depending on which way you're defending it. But big data is really all about trying to go beyond what sort of traditional data has been about. And again, I'll just talk to it in a very brief way. In traditional data processing environments, which sounds ancient, but that's really the model that we've been working with. It's the Von Neumann model of computing, which has literally been around for almost 60, 70 years at this point in time. We took the data and we ran it to a processor, and we processed the data, and then we looked at the outputs on the other side. That approach to data management has some drawbacks and limitations, and one of the biggest ones is that it's very difficult to introduce massive parallelism into that architecture. So big data really is about trying to say, can we implement an architecture solution where we take the processing and move it to the data instead of the data to move to the processing. Now, this is not a class on big data or MDM or anything like that, but okay, so you've got on one side some data that we'd like to share across organizational boundaries, the master data. Maybe things like customer information. You may want to have all parts of your organization access the same view of the customer. By the way, that was also the goal of CRM, or customer relationship management. We know how well that worked out for everybody in there. So if we're looking at MDM and big data, if we don't have proper metadata and governance underneath there, we will not be able to implement either of those correctly. And when we look across MDM solutions at why they are not working out as well as they should, it's generally because of the lack of governance, and the governance would be around defining specific metadata components in that master data and then seeing how those translate into your big data environment. I'm sorry, it's a bit of a convoluted answer in there, but if we need some clarification, you can ping us back on that and we'll come back into it. So anyway, metadata is absolutely essential to making those two pieces work together. Short answer to that question.
Okay, great. The next question is, how does the MDM repository link to the actual data repository to facilitate business intelligence and decision making?
These guys here in the same webinar, they sound like MDM questions here, right? Hey, who knows? Okay, so how does the MDM repository link to the actual data repository? Okay, well, that's a technical question, but I think that the question is asking is very, very good, because if you have a master data management repository and you're not able to link that metadata to the other things that are going on in your BI or in other types of decision-making environments, it's going to be extremely difficult for you. So I don't know specifically how, but I think that's a question. If I was evaluating either a BI solution or a master data solution, I would absolutely go back in and make sure that they could demonstrate that capability. It's one thing to say it's really easy. It's another thing to show people how it actually works. So interesting questions in there. People are obviously interested in MDM in there. Maybe the question that was the metadata repository, and then let me just answer that in anticipation that that might actually be it. So how does the metadata repository link to the data repositories? And again, a good tool, and you'll see this, the vendors have lots of ways of doing this. They're generally through an API or some type of integration technology that you're using. Many others use XML in there, but you can see that that's got to be clearly an automated function. You can't have a request coming in and then have a person who sits down and tries to look this stuff up and figure it out. So again, how that actually links, that's going to be up to the specific technology, but it's a very appropriate question for you to ask as you're looking at your various solutions and vendors that are proposing solutions for you.
All right, and the next question is, how do you rationalize rot and big data where data is often highly denormalized?
Interesting. Rationalize rot. Okay, I'm going to assume there that you mean when you say rot, rationalize rot, it's how to get rid of it. What we're really trying to do is to eliminate data that is redundant, obsolete, or trivial, and we just don't want to have it around. Again, it's something that creates a drag on our organization. Now, the big data component of it, again, is going to be another way of working with that so that you can again, try to get things out of it that you weren't able to get through normal processing. That's all going to be a challenge for everybody. And again, I can't give you specific guidance that's existing in there, but what you do end up having is again, this ability to within your big data environment, pull out and look at some of these things. So by the way, another characteristic of big data is you're going to see probably less structure in it and less quality control that goes into it in the first place. So all of those are going to be challenging for you in there. But you're going to use metadata to help you eliminate and reduce the rot that goes into that particular one. Okay, yeah, asking for clarification. Great, I love it's interactive. Again, more of a comparison between rot and the often denormalized big data. Okay, well that's a good one. Big data, of course, you're looking for things. Big data is you're looking for a needle in a haystack. Rot, from a corporate perspective, means that if I'm going to look up and find information about Peter, who is a customer of our organization, and I find conflicting data in there because nobody's gotten rid of old data. I have an interesting thing on my my own personal credit record in that it thinks I'm married to my stepsister, which is kind of an interesting process in there. They've got it confused at the credit bureaus, and so every time I'm asked to do some coordination on it, it's because they can't get rid of old things that were in there that were never supposed to be in there in the first place. So good question, Jeff, on that. Again, what you're doing to try and rationalize rot is you're trying to eliminate redundant, obsolete, or trivial stuff, and you can do that through metadata. Big data is going to be a very different approach to that. And big data is really not something that you're mining and grabbing and trying to keep as a data asset, but you're really trying to use it from an investigation purpose to help organizations strategize about where they should go on that. Again, good questions, and thanks for the clarification there. It helped.
Okay, and the next question is, what is your recommendation regarding concepts that are very similar across lines of business, say customer, but are truly different? How do you come up with the naming and definitions?
Great question. One of my favorite examples that many of you have heard me give over the years is that I've bought 2 new cars in my life, and each time I bought a new car, Toyota Motor Company sent me a notice that the car was on sale within 30 days of me buying the car. I would, first of all, never, ever, ever, under any circumstances, let anybody in IT or business label a customer as simply a customer. It's too vague a concept. In fact, I heard a great definition of it this morning. I forget who I was talking to, but they said a customer is anybody who you interact with. So that's going to be a little bit different piece. But let's just take the example that I gave you there. Whereas I'm a customer, I wander into a Toyota dealership, I buy a new Toyota, they give me a deal on it, I'm happy, I walk out, and within a month, that same dealership sends me information that tells me that the car I bought last month is now cheaper. So, of course, what do? I go back into the dealership and say, hey, I want my money back. you can see here that when I say don't label anything as simple as a customer, at least in the Toyota dealerships area, they should have defined a taxonomy of customers. You have customer at the top, which we never use that term, and then we have two branches. The first one is current customer. Don't send sales information to people who just bought your product. That's a good business rule. Then the other type, the other branch, if you will, would be potential customer. So then the first question that you have when you look at a customer is, what type of customer is it? Is it a potential customer, or is it a current customer? And that works out very nicely. You can subdivide that further and start to build your nice little taxonomy that comes up there. But it gets a little confusing. For example, just try to fit the concept of X customer in that. Now, when you come up with the naming conventions and things like that, it's important to make the business understand that these are problems. And the best way to illustrate that is what happens when you don't do that. And I've just given you a very brief story there about my experiences buying Toyotas, and I'm very happy with my Toyotas. And the guy's name, by the way, is Bob Nelson, and he's real happy for me to repeat his name because he says, you've mentioned my name a bunch of times over the world, and people walk in here and go, oh, you're the one Peter was talking about on those webinars. Anyway, Bob understands this as well, by the way, but he can't do anything about it because the Toyota dealership has a system that's outsourced to them. So illustrating the problems of these is the first step along there. Make sure that they understand that there is a problem by calling them the same thing. Then use these qualifiers, as we've talked about, to say current customer, potential customer, right? Or reverse it and call it customer.potential, customer.current. But don't let anybody get away with something as simple as vague as customer, because it's never going to work and it's always going to cause you problems. And then find some stories that help people understand, these ideas that they can use and illustrate the cost to the business of having that. If let's pretend that the Toyota dealership had given 1,000 people a $250 refund on each of those cars. Well, that's a very tangible cost that could have easily been avoided by just not telling them that the thing was on sale. I hope that answers your question. It's a little bit involved, but let's move on to the next one here.
All right. Can you expand on the relationship between XML and metadata? Are you recommending heavy use of XML within the repository? Are you referring to communications between sources and the repository?
Terrific question. I did not address this in the piece, and I just want people to be aware of XML. So XML stands for Extensible Markup Language, and what that means is that XML is really about metadata. It's really about descriptions that occur. It's a way of describing in a human and machine-readable format the same information. So XML is inherently about metadata. Most metadata solutions incorporate it. All of the various databases incorporated. In Oracle, you can go in and take a schema or a description of the database layout and have Oracle export that in an XML format. When you move into a service-oriented environment, it's almost always done with messaging, and those messages are almost always XML. So XML is a wonderful technology. It's an adjunct to data management technologies that we use, and it very, very happily combines this. Again, I've got another talk that I do on XML, but if that doesn't get it for you, let's dive in for some subsequent questions there. As far as communications between the source and the repository, that's a messaging type format, and it may or may not need to include XML. That's probably going to be something driven by the vendor, although if you have input into that process, I would encourage you to examine it, because XML is one of the best things that has happened to data management over the last 50 years. All right. Next question.
Okay, next question is, metadata management seems to be a low priority in many organizations. What are the core arguments or value-add statements for metadata management?
Great. Well, let's go back to the Gartner definition, first of all. Metadata unlocks the value of data. So if you have data and you're not doing any metadata at all, probably it's going to be harder for you to demonstrate that you have unlocked the value of that corporate asset. Now, we can go a little bit further than that. I've said back in the presentation that data management is about leverage. Let's go back to the example that the gentleman brought up before this one, where we've got customer that's used in different parts of the organization. What we'd really find very inefficient is if we had multiple systems all maintaining customer data. By the way, the average organization maintains customer data in 17 locations. If you're under that, you're actually in good shape. So I was working with a bank the other day, and they said, oh, we're down to 15, so we're above average. And it's good to know where you are, but 15 is still a long way from 1. So you need to know not only what data is stored in what source, but how you can go back and gain access to that